Greetings everyone, my name is Johan Martin and I'm working under the name of Punch Sector Studios, and I was tasked with the opportunity to mix these drums as part of the Franken-Mix challenge. And it's a very interesting challenge, I think, because normally you would mix everything in one project, having all the instruments there. But in my case, I've got all the tracks for the drums, but the rest of the instruments are just contained unmixed inside this single file here. You can hear how it sounds.
Why is it every time I see you, it feels like this won't end?
So there's basically some leveling and stuff done by Sam earlier in a video. You will see the link in the description. He set the levels, but otherwise this is not mixed at all, apart from the levels and panning. So I've got the drums in one folder here to mix, and I have this file to kind of balance these off a little bit, but it's going to be a very different result compared to a normal mix because I can't mix all these instruments very much individually. So I just have them to kind of reference a little bit to make sure that it's not out of whack totally, because the drum mix is gonna sound different if you're hearing the guitars and stuff at the same time. I'm gonna show you some examples later with that. I did, however, try a little bit of mid scoop, removing stuff that I thought I might have done generally on the entire mix anyways. Or on the individual channels, just to reference a little bit, but I didn't use that a lot. I just made it, I made a tiny scoop here and a tiny scoop there to just check if everything was alright at the end of the drum mix. So first I've got a thing to think about that's very important with drums. It's because when you record an entire kit like this with all of these microphones, there's gonna be phase issues probably, and you need to check for that. Most important, I would say, is in these close mics. For example, the kick drum here has 3 different microphones. There's an inside in the drum, one outside, and then a sub mic. A sub mic is usually a speaker, but it's wired backwards, so it's very big and catches a lot of the sub information. So if we zoom into the hardest hit here in the song, this, you can see here, this one goes up and then it goes down in the waveform, and this, I would guess this means the speaker cone of your headphones or your speakers are pushing outwards here, and then this tells them to go inwards instead, and this creates a frequency, and all these tiny ones are all the higher frequencies kind of riding off of the big one. So for example, if this one goes the other way at the same time as this one, this one tells the speaker to go out, this one tells the speaker to go in. If they cancel each other out like this, it's going to sound very weak and thin. You can hear an example here if we solo these. You can hear that especially in the low end. A lot of that disappears when you phase shift. The high frequencies are way more complex, so those are not going to matter as much, but the low end needs to be in focus, especially in the kick drum. The same applies with the snare drum also. If you have a hit like this, usually because the top microphone is on the top of the drum, it's a microphone that's catching the sound of the skin being hit, and when it's being hit it moves downwards first, but the bottom microphone under the drum, that skin is going to move outwards at first, so usually they're going to look like this when you record it. So either the recording engineer will do that for you while recording or after recording, or otherwise you'll have to check and make sure that they're in phase. This also applies with the room mics and the overheads. Having these out of phase with the microphones can sometimes create some problems with the focus, for example, with the snare drum. Usually it's not a huge problem though, because room mics are usually meant to sound far away, and if the snare hit is here on the snare track, and on the room track it's not until here that the sound has reached the microphone, that's not going to create a huge problem because the sound comes afterwards anyways. On the overheads it might be a bit closer, but in this case, in this recording, there's actually not a lot of snare at all in the overheads, which leads me to believe that these are maybe programmed drums, but I'm not entirely sure actually. One thing that I thought about with the room mics, you can see I've got two room mics, room tracks here for the closed ones. These are actually the same ones, but if we look at the snare track here, for example, on this is the original track that I got, which is disabled in the final mix because you can see here, this is the snare, I think. Yeah, it's the snare getting hit. It moves up here, but these are two microphones, so this is the right one, this is the left. The right one probably was a tiny bit further away from the snare, which means that the sound reached it a bit afterwards, so it reaches the left one here and then the right one here. So this is going up while this one is going down, which create a bit of a phase issue. It's not a huge thing, but some people can be really sensitive to this. I prefer it to be in phase because it creates a bit more focus, a bit more centered snare sound. So what I did was I took this track, I split it into two separate mono tracks, and then I moved this one slightly to this one. So this is what I ended up with. Now they're moving at the same time in harmony with each other, which kind of centered the snare a little bit. So then I disabled this. I just kept this in to show you how the original looked. I did the same thing with the mid mic, I think. So yeah, that's about the phase. It's usually way more important with these close mics when they're on the same drum, but it doesn't hurt to check the overheads and the rooms as well. So let's talk about the routing of these tracks. This is how I usually do it with drums. So you can see kick and snare has multiple microphones, and then there's the toms, overheads, and rooms. I usually put stuff like this. So first I have a real, like the real microphone, so to say. I don't know if this is real or if it's programmed. But this is the original microphones that were routed into this bus here. I process those, then I route that plus the sample into this master kick bus with just a tiny bit of processing. Then all of those master buses get routed to the clean drums, which is one bus for all the drums without any parallel compression or reverb. Then that is routed into the main drum bus, which also has these auxiliary effect channels, which in this case I've got some processing here that I'll talk about soon. Then I send these two, I actually use on the instrumental bus usually, because these affect the whole mix except for the vocals. But in this case I did it here because that I can't process a lot of these stuff, because this is only the raw, everything else, and then I have the drums separately. So I had to kind of rework my way of working a bit. And then that goes to a so-called fake master bus. The actual master bus is down here, stereo out, but I like to have a separate one here. This is because I've got some reference tracks here and I don't want to process those with any kind of mastering or pseudo mastering processing. So I want the reference tracks to just go through their own little bus here, and this one goes to the stereo out separately from this one. This one also goes to stereo out, so the reference tracks are not affected by any of these. So the reference tracks are usually two keep a good low end balance, for example, it's sometimes difficult to hear, especially in an untreated room that I have, if I have too much bass or too little bass, or if it's too bright or too dark sounding. So I have a couple of songs here that I like that I like how they sound. So I kind of, towards the end of the mix, I check these to see if I'm on a reasonable level. I also level match these relatively to my mix, so they don't sound automatically better just because they're louder. So I usually master a tiny bit quieter than most people, mostly because this is just pseudo mastering to kind of hear how it's gonna sound as a finished product. This might not be the actual mastering going on, especially not in this one, because in this Franken-Mix challenge, the final part will be the actual mastering with a guy that's not mixing any of the other parts of the song. So this leads me into my top-down mixing approach. This is a term that has become, at least to my knowledge, has become more popular during the last couple of years. This means that you do a little bit of processing on the master channel or any kind of channel that has all of the other tracks routed to it, to kind of do stuff that you will do on the individual tracks anyways. So what I usually do on the instrumental bus, but in this case the drum bus, is I start with this. This is just the Slate virtual mix rack. I add a bit of top end because most of the microphones here, they're a raw recorded drum kit always sounds a bit too dark compared to what's going to be in the final product. So I add some top end here, not too much though, because it might be too much, but it's just a tiny bit of help on the way. So I add that. Then I have this bus compressor, which I usually don't put on until a bit later in the mix. Then on the master, I've got the FabFilter Pro Q3 just to, if I need to change something in the entire mix. As I'm having this on the master bus, and this is looking at all the instruments at the same time, doing a tiny bit of adjustment can do a lot to the sound. Then I've got the Slate virtual tape machines. This is not a crucial part, but it just adds a bit of icing on the cake, a bit of warmth, so to speak. You know, the analog mojo that everyone's talking about. So I like a bit of that. Then I've recently started using the K-clip to clip the mix, actually. That can make the mix louder while not doing, for example, if you use a limiter instead, if you overuse that limiter, you can really kill the impact of the drums, for example. So the clipper you can use a bit more volume, but at the same time not affect the sound as much as a limiter would do. So it's working very well to do that. And then I finally have a limiter at the end of the chain. So without the K-clip, I would need to add more gain to this and then affect the sound more with the limiter. So this is just a mastering chain to kind of hear how we would sound with mastering, because I found that if I mix without mastering enabled, then it's not gonna work as well as if I put all these things on from the beginning and then kind of mix into that. So adjust all the levels and all the dynamics, hearing how it might sound in the final version. Because when this is getting mastered, there's probably gonna be some limiting, I'm pretty sure, and then maybe some clipping as well. So when finally exporting the mix to get mastered, I just remove the clipping and then I just remove the limiting as well. Although I like to, instead of bypassing the plugin, just to be sure, I just move that to 0, and then I keep the output as at -1, so I'm sure that it's not hitting the ceiling at any point during the song, because sometimes it's just a tiny bit of, like, one drum hit in the entire song that goes above the threshold, so to say. So to the kick drum, I've got the real kick here. As I said, I balanced these 3 microphones at first. The only individual processing I did here was on the sub kick. I removed some high end because it had a bunch of stuff that I don't really needed to add. So let's hear how it sounded first. And then adding the low pass filter. Then it's only containing the sub frequencies that I need and not a bunch of mid-range that I would remove anyways further down the line. So then I process all of these 3 in one bus here. First I like to start with a drum leveler. This is mainly to level out the hits. This is pretty consistent already from the beginning, because again I'm suspecting this might be programmed. But it's programmed in a good way, so for example you can hear that there's some bleed from the cymbals and snare. So that kind of adds to realism a little bit, although I like to remove a little bit of the bleed in between the hits using this gate here. I don't remove everything because I find that can mess up the sound a bit much, but I just remove, in this case, 5 dB. Usually I won't need to do much on the kick drum. And I'm also leveling out the hits with this knob, 77% in this case. So you can see all these orange hits are getting louder than they were originally. If I just put this as 0, this is the level that we're at, and then this is where they were now. So that's just making it a bit more consistent. I like the kick drum to be consistent in that it's kicking you the same amount in the chest every hit, except for example when there's quieter sections, but that's happening anyways through some other tricks I'm gonna show you later. Then I'm using a transient designer because I thought that the sustain was a bit long, mostly in the low end. This is mostly audible if you use a subwoofer or a sub pack like I do in my case. I can hear the low end kind of rumbling along a little bit longer than I wanted to. I wanted to be a short stab of a punchy kick drum instead of a kick and then it's like sorry, I'm continuing to play there, but this is removing some of that sustain, just a tiny bit, not to go overboard. Then I've got some EQ. Usually with kick drums I need to remove a bunch of mid-range and stuff because it sounds more like a cardboard than I wanted to. So these are areas that I don't like. This is around 500, 400, which is the kind of cardboard sound. So I'll show you these disabled and then I'll show you how it sounds when I mess with the different bands. You see it already becomes way more like a kick drum that you're used to hearing. Because this is a fairly rocky song, I want that kind of sound and not the big huge 26-inch 50s jazz kick drums or whatever. Then this band I removed some 1K because there was too much. It sounds almost like a wind kind of sound, like air flowing through your ears. So I removed a bunch of that, and then there's usually some spots between 1 and 200 which has some of that like boom kind of sound. I'll show you what happens when I boost it. So yeah, that makes this all together makes the kick drum sound a bit more tight and not as boomy in the wrong way. I like it to be boomy down around 50, 60, maybe 70 hertz here instead of all the way up here. Then I've got some additive EQ with this SSL channel from Brainworks. This is becoming very popular right now, but there's a bunch of other emulations of the SSL channels out there, so you can get pretty much identical results, but this one has some features that I really like. So what I like to do with this SSL is just I leave the high shelf at 8K and then I just boost, and then I usually don't mess with this knob at all, so I can just use this for a general brightness boost on any kind of, like I can use it on guitars or bass as well, and vocals, like it works for most things in my case. The reason why I'm doing it here instead of the fab filter is because since this is an emulation of an analog mixing desk, this is gonna sound a bit different. Analog stuff also adds a little bit of distortion, which can be pleasant, especially with this little screw here, which is the THD, which is total harmonic distortion, which can fatten up stuff and make it sound just a little bit more nice, you know, the icing on the cake again. Also, having this at full, I think minus 30 is the full, yeah. So what I usually do with kick, I have it almost full, and then you have to back this fader off a bit because this will make it a bit louder. Then I have a little bit of extra subtractive EQ here, which is slightly above 1K. Removed some stuff. I could have done that in the fab filter, but I just did it here because I had this open and just, I don't know, that kind of stuff happens sometimes. Nothing wrong with that. So let's hear how it sounds without this brightness boost and then with it. So we're getting a bit further towards the goal of having the kick drum that cuts through the mix and sounds like a nice punchy kick drum and not a cardboard being hit by a hammer. The final thing on this bus here is the smash and grab compressor. I've got it in kick mode, grab, which grab probably means about 30 milliseconds attack and maybe 100 to 150 milliseconds of release. This plugin was made by Misha and Nolly from Periphery, and Nolly has talked a lot about his settings, what he likes to use for compression. I would guess that it's similar with the snare. From what I know, this is also modeled after some analog gear, but I think they have mixed some stuff, some different compressors for each thing. So the kick one is suited to what I guess fits Nolly's taste the most. I just like this tool because it not only sounds good, but it's also just so easy to just put it on kick and then lower the threshold until it sounds good. So this is just to bring out a little bit more attack and clamp down on the sustain after each hit. So let's hear how that sounds. So that tightens up the sound and it makes it sound like he's hitting the drum a little bit harder, which I like. And then I usually like to compress this a little bit more than what sounds good, and then back off this mix knob a bit, because then I'm getting a little bit of the original signal in, which is kind of nice. It's kind of a parallel compression vibe. For some reason I like that more than just compressing like that, but that also works without using a mix knob. There's nothing wrong with either. I just prefer this way. So that's the kick drum. Then I added a sample. We got a sample with the other tracks. This is how that sounded. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that it doesn't fit my taste as much as I would like it to. This is a very clicky sounding kick drum. It sounds like the click is almost too high and too, like, it stabs my ears. So I like my kick drums to sound a bit more like slappy and wet in a way. You know, the mixing world is full of these terms to describe sounds, and slappy and wet is what I like in my kick drums, not knocky and not sharp sounding. So I removed this sample, and then I used one of my own samples that a guy named Jackson Ward did for me. I paid him to do the sample privately. You might have seen him on Glenn Fricker's channel. We arrived at this sample here that I really liked, and I used this a lot to add the kind of complex but not sharp sounding high end, and just to fan up the most of the drum. So I'm using slate trigger here to just trigger the kick. I've phase shifted this because I would guess the sample moves in the other way compared to these mics at the beginning of each hit, like I told you in the beginning. This is how that sounds unprocessed. So that also has a lot of that kind of cardboardy, boxy mid-range, but it also has a soft but prominent attack that I really like. But to process this, I took this transient designer and did the same thing as with the original kick, to remove some sustain because I wanted it to be a bit tighter than what it was in the beginning. Then there's a lot of sculpting here with EQ. This might even be a bit too much, but in this case I wanted to kind of sculpt out stuff that I didn't want to add, because the main thing with the sample is the low end and the high end that I really like. So let's hear it. This is going to be a pretty big difference. So now we're getting somewhere. This is approaching my kind of favorite sound with the kick drum. Same approach with the SSL. In this case I also removed some 1.5K here for some reason. This distortion screw at full, I screwed it. Then a bunch of high end. So now this might even sound a bit too bright and tiny, but blended in with the original kick, I arrived at what I thought was a good sound for this mix. This will also be affected by how the guitars are sounding, so bear with me. Some smash and grab, same kind of approach there, mix a bit lower, compressing a bit more than I would do otherwise. Then some further brightness boost with this Moog EQ. This has a kind of, you know, this is even called the airband. I like the high end to be airy. I usually say with the kick drums. And with this EQ, it's very famous for being able to add a lot of high end without sounding too sharp or too abrasive. So I've put this as 15, and this probably, you know, it doesn't add just a tiny bit of 15 like this. Like you might think, like if I was starting out mixing, I would think that this is what happened. I would guess that it's something like this, you know, but I don't know. There's a plugin called Plugin Doctor, or a program called Plugin Doctor, where you can see exactly what's happening with all of these things. But that's up to you to play with. So this is the final sound we arrive at with the sample. So it's got a very audible and bright attack, but at the same time it's very soft sounding, which I really like. So adding that together with the original kick, let's see. This it's dangerous because this, when it sounds this good, I can get a bit ecstatic and just sit and listen to the kick drum for hours, even when listening to the whole song. I'm just like, oh man, that kick drum sounds so good. I realized just now I had some processing on the kick main bus here as well. This is just the samples together and some tape distortion. This 2-track mode fans it up a little bit. Adds a little bump in the low end, which is nice for a kick drum. So yeah, kick drum accomplished. Let's move on to the snare drum. So, snare drum. Same thing here as the kick. We have 2 different microphones. Kick out 3, this is only 2. And the sample. There's a little bit of processing on the individual channels here first. So with the snare top, you can hear there's a lot of hi-hat there in between the hits. This is a trick which is becoming very common these days, to use multiband compression, or rather expansion, to remove high hand when you're in between the hits, and then when the snare is hitting, you get the full spectrum. So this is how that works. So you're getting that high-end crack when it's hitting the drum, but then in between it's removing all the hi-hat sizzle, and at the same time you're keeping the rest of the bleed, which is good if you want some more like cohesion with your tracks, because removing too much and separating everything too much can you lose that glue that you need. At least in my opinion, a good drum sound has a lot of that cohesion between all of the elements. So that's everything on the top mic. On the bottom mic, I've got some compression going on. This is set on snare, but on smash mode. Smash means that it's way faster attack, similar to an 1176 style compressor, which I like to use for the snare bottom because it removes some of the hits, so it doesn't make the hits sound like too sizzly, but it kind of keeps that sustain that the bottom mic has. And then you can also raise it a bit more in volume without like making the attack of the whole drum sound like farty or whatever. So this is what's happening with that. So this is mainly for sustain, and sometimes there's ghost notes here as well, and those will be more prominent if you can level out the main hits here, and then you can get the ghost notes to come up a little bit. Then on the real bus here with the snare, I've got the drum leveler again, doing the same thing as the kick, removing a little bit of the bleed in between and leveling out the hits. I usually set this as -5. This is different from person to person. I just pick that target and go with it. Then fab filter, I removed some mid-range. I didn't need to do that much because this drum sounded pretty good from the beginning. So it's kind of making it a bit more focused and removing some of that, the cardboard sound that we don't like in drums generally. Similar thing with the SSL thing here. You can just use this as a brightness control, some distortion. This can also help to remove the sharp kind of attack that you can get with a snare drum when you boost a bunch of high end. Having some distortion can kind of shave off that very sharp sounding initial beginning of the attack, so that's helpful. There's another stage of that later in the chain here, which I'll show you, but this is the brightness boost. So that's turning pretty bright. Remember, this will sound a bit different in the context of the whole mix. Then some compression again, set on snare, grab mode, so I let some of the attack through but clamp down on the sustain. Now you've got a lot of that stick attack, but the sustain is not as puffy and sizzly. And then some of that mix is taken down to, I think this is about 90%. So the final thing is some more distortion from this tape machine plugin by Slate, and this is shaving off further from the very sharp beginning of the attack. So it kind of fattens the whole drum up in a way, but it's still very audible, and you can still have it pretty loud. So just raising this input until these red lamps here are lighting every time the drum is hit. So yeah, if you overdo it, it's gonna be a bit too extreme. You remove all of the attack almost, so it's a fine balance to kind of get it to just light up, and then you can hear the attack shaving off a little bit, but you keep most of it if you don't go overboard. Then I've added a sample here. This is the sample that I got with the tracks from Sam. This sample, it worked pretty well, so I kept it. I liked how it sounded from the beginning. This is the raw sample. You can hear it has some of that room sound in it too, so it kind of works as a room mic. It's more of a complete package compared to the close mics. So it adds some ambience, and you can see it's a stereo track, so there's some stereo room and probably overhead information going on there as well. First I put some transient designer on this to add some of the attack because I thought it sounded a bit tired in a way. So it makes it sound like he's hitting a bit harder. Similar to the smash and grab, but in this case I did it with this first and then at another stage later with the compression. Then some more of that mid scoop. Then some compression to clamp down on the sustain again, because there's a lot of sustain in this one. It's a very satisfying way to hear that snap come through, and then it's kind of clamping down, so it's a bit tighter. Something about that I really love about the compression on the drums. So blending that in with the real snare. Sounds pretty nice. Then on the main bus, all I've got is the removing some low end that we don't need. You can hear and see how it sounds with it disengaged. You know, there's a bunch of stuff here under 100 Hertz that I don't need at all. There's also some kick drum information here that I just find it nice to remove that, so I don't have to worry about it. Then going to toms, we've got 3 real tom tracks here and then 3 samples. I've got a bit of drum leveler on all of them, I think. In this case, the tracking engineer was nice enough to cut out all the silence in between the hits. I usually like to do this myself if no one's done it before. Sending the files. Usually with toms the bleed is way more difficult to deal with compared to the snare and kick, so I like to just have the hits on the tracks and nothing in between. On more softer genres you can probably get away with having some bleed and then just doing something similar to this multiband trick instead. But I also like in this case to do some drum leveler to level out the hits. This is maybe not necessary in this case because I could just take all these hits and kind of level them by myself, but I like to just have an automatic process doing that for me in this case. Let's see if we can solo one part here where we can hear the drum. This is gonna be annoying. So I've got some transient design here to make it sound like it's hitting it harder because the attack didn't come through in the way I liked. Then with just a tiny bit of extra attack in there. Then some fab filter I just removed some bottom end in this case. I experimented with removing some mids. I usually do this, but you'll see in a second why I didn't use up these. I recently saw a video with Nolly, previous bassist of Very Free, where he showed this trick that he learned from someone else that I don't remember the name of, where you can use distortion, and especially in this FabFilter Saturn plugin, to kind of create a good tom sound very quickly. So this is a multi-band distortion, so you can distort different frequencies differently with different settings. So what he showed was, on the high end, distort that a little bit so it's not too sharp, just like I did with the snare, but only on the top end. So adding some drive naturally adds some volume to it as well. Then the mids, remove a bunch of that, but also distort them a little bit. Removing these and then not doing anything to the low end will kind of quickly get you that modern tom sound. So let's hear how it affects the whole thing. So yeah, it very quickly becomes a great sounding tom. Some compression. Here I used the smash mode again with very fast attack, so it clamps down on the attack portion. So I've got the kind of character from hitting harder with the transient designer here, but then I'm kind of shaving it off a little bit, so it's still audible, but it's a bit lower in volume, so it levels out the whole drum, which makes it easier to hear in the mix without it just being attack, because having the attack too loud can make the rest sound like nothing, and this kind of levels it out a bit. And there's another stage of the same thing here with a limiter that I used. This is just a tiny bit of extra shaving off there. You're seeing it's removing about 2 dB, that's not much, but it's doing a tiny bit to level it out. Similar things with the other toms. I'm just gonna engage these. No transient designer on tom 3 because I thought the attack was good enough as it was. But otherwise there's similar processing. There was only for this first one that I needed to remove some of the level of the attack with this compressor and limiter, but then these were fine as they were. Then I got the samples here. You can see that these are stereo tracks, which means that they were pre-panned before being exported as audio files. And then what I did to make sure that they were panned exactly the same as the original tracks was that I just put these into mono tracks. In Cubase here you can see that this is just one thing. Here there's two things. So one means that it's mono, two means that it's stereo. So you just put these into mono tracks, and then I could pan them. This is left 36, just the same as the original Tom 1. Also left 36, just to make sure that they're exactly the same. Didn't need to do as much processing on these. This is how it sounds without these. Just a bit of attack and removed some of the sustain, because samples can, because there's no bleed here, the sustain can be way longer, way more audible as well. So no one has cut out any sustain here. On the original, they've cut it out right here. This sample has no bleed, so they didn't need to cut it out at all. So the sustain continues to all the way over here. So I just like to remove some of that so it doesn't rumble on for too long. And added some attack as well, so it sounded like it's hit harder. Then some EQ, just some general things. This is similar to what the kick had, sort of that rumble but in the wrong way, but I removed it here instead, just to keep some of that fundamental note that's down here. and then remove some of the boominess that's right above it. So the other samples, I did similar things with those. Then we arrived at the final tom sound. I think there's a section here with all of them playing. So here's all the toms. Sounds pretty fat and nice, which I like, especially in conjunction with the kick drum. Toms and kick together can make my day. So let's move on to the overheads. There's, in this case, just a stereo pair of overheads and then the hi-hat. Sometimes there's also microphones for ride and splashes and chinas and all of that. But this song is a bit simpler, so I don't think they needed to do that at all. Sometimes there's, you know, fast technical death metal stuff, and when you really want to hear the individual splashes and all the tiny stuff going on, just to balance out all the cymbals so that they're all audible. So there's no processing on the overheads themselves, and then on the hi-hat I just removed some. There was a couple of ringing frequencies, and then some mid stuff that I didn't want. So this is how this sounds. Then I'm blending that with the overheads on the real track. In this case I didn't use any samples for the overheads, so I didn't really need to have a real and a separate master track for that. But yeah, this is just how I usually have it, so I kept it for no apparent reason. With these overheads, they sounded pretty good from the start, so I didn't need to remove that much. I removed some of the mids again, and then some of the abrasive high mids up here. Let's hear how that sounds. So this shifts the focus a little bit further up, especially with the crashes. These areas can sound jabbing in your ears. In this case though, they were pretty good recorded anyways. You can hear that there's almost no kick and snare in the overheads. Usually there's way more in real recorded overheads. This also means that I didn't have to remove them much. Usually I use some kind of compression to do that. Some kind of fast attack stuff. But in this case I didn't need to do that. So I just added some high end here up at 15k. This is also probably a high shelf with a very low Q, so it's affecting way more than just 15k. Adding some sparkle to the whole thing. Then some compression. This is in this case I use this to kind of extend the sustain of the cymbals a bit, because I like them to kind of wash over the mix without being too much. I keep the mix knob as a 50%, so it's compressing and adding some sustain, but at the same time keeping some of that natural sound in there. So let's hear how that affects the whole thing. So yeah, just a tiny bit. Overdoing that can make it sound very messy, which can work in some genres, but in this case I don't want too much of that. So in this case the overheads were really simple. Sometimes they can be a nightmare to mix, but yeah, these were well sounding tracks from the beginning, so I didn't need to do that much to them. Then finally on the overheads I just usually remove some low end, although in this case you can see there's not much anyways because there's no kick drum in there, so I didn't really need to remove any low end, although I left this plugin here for some reason. I don't really use it in the final mix I did here. Then we're on to roomed tracks. So there were a lot of room tracks in this project. I didn't end up using all of them, but yeah, as you saw, I corrected some phase stuff with these close and mid mics. So I did a little bit of individual processing on all the rooms because they sound so wildly different that I need to solve some problems with them individually before processing them all in one main bus. In this close mic here, There's a lot of snare drum, which is very nice because the rooms are very useful to make the snare, particularly the snare sound, bigger. So I've used some compression here, fast attack again, smash mode, to remove some of the attack from the snare drum, but keep more of that sustain in there. So this makes the snare drum almost sound like it's further away, which adds to the space that I can bring. So yeah, remove some of that attack. A little bit of equalizing. I removed some of the cymbals a bit because I don't like to have too much cymbals in the rooms. And then also some mid scoop because this messed with the whole picture of the drum kit, I noticed. So yeah, I removed some of that. So let's hear it without and with. Not a huge difference, but then again, the sum of all the parts, even big and small, that you're doing in mixing is gonna affect the whole result in the end. Then the mid room, I didn't do anything on the individual channel, but this is how it sounded. So as you can hear, there's already not much attack in the drums at all, so that's kind of solved already with this track. There might have been some compression while recording this. Then the far room sounds like this. To me, the far room sounds like it's a closed mic actually, but yeah, someone might have written the wrong names, I don't know. But I still like to have these three different kind of flavors to put in there. Some EQ I did. I removed some low end because there was a lot of kick drum in this one. And also some mid scoop there again. There was a mono track which I usually don't care about that much, but in this case I did some processing to kind of have a different purpose than just adding more room stuff. So I've used some virtual channel. This is basically similar to the distortion thing and the Brainworks thing. This thing, I would guess this is a similar thing going on, but just in one module. You can set it to different kind of modes here. The 4KE is the SSL 4000E. Then a lot of drive and a lot of input, so it's kind of distorting a little bit. Can you hear if that makes a difference? Maybe, maybe not. Definitely makes it sound a bit more forward in a way. Then a bunch of compression and also some saturation in here. This is basically some tape saturation, similar to the slate, but it's directly in the compressor, which is, in this case, it's just easy to turn it on, and I don't need a bunch of controls really in this case with this room mono. So I also removed some high end. This is the air control, which is a very high shelf, I think. So there's not too much attack or cymbals in there. So yeah, you can have, that's a lot of compression going on. This kind of adds some roominess and, I don't know, mojo to the middle of the drum kit in a way. But this is not very loud in the mix. I just like to have a little bit there. Then there was a room mono bullet. We can listen to it here. I didn't end up using this. Sometimes these can be useful, but I ended up not needing it. There's nothing wrong with removing stuff you don't need. Then there's a room sample here, which is a big snare hit, I think. yeah, you can see this file was called S is probably for snare, so snare huge. Just to emphasize the snare bigness in these sections here in the beginning and this final here. Then there's a room sample only for the snare. This was also called S room, probably snare room, because there's only snare in this. This has some of the attack that I don't want to have in my rooms, so I used a limiter to remove some of that. So you can see it's removing almost 6 dB of attack. And then some smash and grab again, smash mode, to do some further removing of transient and bringing up the sustain. Then on the room main bus here, with the real rooms, I've got some EQ, removing a bunch of mids and some high end. This is, the shelf here is just to remove the cymbals overall, and this high mid thing is to remove the abrasiveness of them, just as I did in the overheads a little bit, and then scooping out some of that mid range so it's not overbearing. So it's sounding a bit more controlled, but I also need to remove some bass on the room thing along with the samples as well. So you can hear the kick drum is not booming as much there. So let's listen to the drums so far together with the other instruments. The drums sound good, but a bit tiny in a way, which is why I use some parallel compression and also reverb. First, I've got this crush bus. Kross means crush in Swedish, which is just the smash and grab again with a very fast attack, smash mode. Extreme here probably increases the ratio, I would guess. A bunch of saturation tape. And in parallel mode, so it's a very kind of extreme sounding pumping compressor. I also use the input and output gain, because reducing the threshold won't do anything to the input, but when you raise the input like this, it's gonna distort in its own way a little bit. Just like when adding gain to a guitar amplifier, for example. Then there's also gonna be some distortion with an output knob if you use that, but in this case I want some input distortion, just a bunch of messy stuff, but you're gonna hear why it works. So I send most of the drums to this, the kick drum -10, the snare I think is -4. Sometimes I can put this at just 0 and send a lot of snare to that bus. A bit of toms. This is always going to vary with all of the different recordings, because sometimes you need to add a lot of stuff, sometimes not so much. The overheads just a tiny bit, because I don't want the cymbals to become too overpowered and messy. Some rooms as well. So pretty much the whole kit is sent to this crush bus, and this is how it sounds. So pretty distorted and big sounding. Adds a bit of glue to everything and kind of makes the drum kit sound more as its own thing, but it's also going to increase the sustain and it's going to make the drum sound bigger with the rest of the instruments. So let's hear with and without. So it adds a bit more power. Then I also got this smisk means spank in Swedish, and this is the only instance where I don't use the smash and grab actually for the drums. This is the Valley People Dynamite compressor, which is a very special sounding thing. I use this to get more attack, but as I said before, I like a very soft attack with the kick, and this helps with that somehow because it's distorting a lot. You're gonna see this clip diode kind of light up every time something's hitting. So this brings some attack, but at the same time keeps it nice and soft in a way. So this one I send only the kick, snare, and toms to. Let's see, the kick is, yeah, spank, and some toms. Not too much because I don't want the attack to be too jarring with those. So this is how that sounds. So a lot of nice sounding attack with that. And distortion as well. Distortion is your friend if you want stuff to sound big and fat. And then I've got some reverb, which I think I'm sending the snare, yes, and the toms too. So this is the reverb by itself, which is just a tiny bit of extra space to those drums. So the final thing that I did was with the toms. Sometimes when the toms along with the rooms are hitting, then the rooms, although I scooped a bunch of mid-range out of the toms, the rooms contain a lot of mid-range and kind of mess with the image I want from the toms. So this is how that sounds. So you can hear there's a lot of boo 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 in the rooms when the toms are hitting. So I send these to a multiband compressor on the room. This removes some mid-range just when the toms are hitting, because this sidechain input is activated. So this is only gonna compress when the toms are sending their signal to this multiband. So this is what's happening when that's hitting. Overdoing this can kind of make the toms glue less with the rooms and the rest of the kit, but doing just the right amount can kind of keep the toms sound more modern in a way, while not removing too much of the mids from the rooms. Then finally, what I did to make the drums kind of work with the song as a whole was to do some automation, because this song has a lot of guitars and stuff happening in the intro and the choruses, but then in the verses it's way more laid back and a lot more clean guitars, and the vocals are coming down a bit in tone. So what I did was I lowered some of the, especially some of the snare sample room here, and then the rooms overall, to make the whole drum kit sound a little bit more intimate, and then it kind of breaks loose during the choruses. You can see all of these moves are pretty much the same thing, but on the different tracks. Same with the snare sample, because the snare sample in this case I used it more to kind of cut through the rest of the mix, which it needed way more help during the choruses compared to the verses, because I don't want it to sound too mechanical and overboard during the verse when it's a bit more quiet and toned down. Same with the spank bus, I don't need as much attack when there's not as many guitars to cut through. So all of these changes, you can hear how they sound on their own when there's only drums playing. So yeah, it comes down a little bit more, and it's more, as I said, intimate. So let's hear how that works with the entire song. First, when it changes from intro to verse and then verse to chorus.
Why is it every time I see you, it feels like this won't take I need, but you're killing me. So hate me, 'cause I can't be there for you. I will never save you.
You can hear that in the chorus. There's a lot more stuff with the other instruments coming to fight for space. So these moves makes the drums able to kind of have their place and cut through when they need to, but then get down a little bit when you don't need all that power. So that was my entire mix, and I hope you're gonna like the final result. I'm very excited to hear how it's gonna be because I'm not mixing the rest of the instruments. Some other people are gonna do that, so I hope this will be a workable drum mix. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys later.